Welcome to Human Histories.
God bless you all. God save the King.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In an age where the so-called civilized are trading slaves, establishing penal colonies in foreign lands, and slaughtering their enemies, who is good and who is evil? Where loot and pillage for the crown is praised and rewarded with gold, but criminal the second it is deemed no longer necessary? Where in the cracks of history do the men that did not conform to the rules of the world fit? Where do the wild men reside? One place we know for certain were the seas of the Caribbean, with the one and only Blackbeard. I'm Riley Osborne, as always with my co-host Ashton Myers. Welcome to the Human Histories podcast. I'm going to dive briefly into how to support the podcast. The best way is to go to humanhistoriespodcast.com. There you can support us by buying our affiliate books, which are the books that we use as sources for the show. You can also donate to the show, and you can, most importantly, message us, ask us questions, give us information that we might have missed, and overall interact with us. Another great way is to go follow us on Instagram. Just today, we got 1,000 Instagram followers, which is awesome, and I want to thank you guys all so much for that. But let's dive into this amazing story, this great story of one of the most interesting men that ever sailed the seas, Blackbeard.
All right, so Blackbeard, he was quite the fellow, quite the scary guy. Not really, but we'll see it as we go on. But before we get to him terrorizing the Caribbean, we first got to understand where he came from. If you guys have listened to the podcast a couple of times by now, you're well aware of the way we begin, right? We're gonna talk about where it came from. So, like many people in history, Blackbeard falls into the we barely know anything about his early life category, and that is not an understatement. That is, like, if anything, that's being generous. Like, we have an idea of where he came from and possibly maybe what his name would have been, and that's about it. So we know that he was born sometime around 1680, given that he died around 1720, which was, would leave him in his late 30s, early 40s. So the name that he was most known by was Edward Teach or Edward Thatch. However, this was most likely an alias. Many pirates hid their real names, likely for more than one reason, whether to prevent damage to the family name or to avoid capture. Either way, it's not really relevant, seeing as the name we all know him now is by now is Blackbeard. I wanted to touch on that briefly, right? Because like the many pirates hid their real names thing. Well, like, you might think, well, why does it matter? They're just outlaws, they're just scoundrels, etc. But as you'll come to see throughout the course of this episode, many of these pirates, and I put like quotations in pirates because when they weren't being pirates, they were being privateers, which was completely legal and, within the full regulations of the law. So it was only once they strayed away from that, like as soon as their use was expended, they were now pirates. So you might have had perfectly respectable men who simply just needed to make a living, who weren't chopping people's heads off and making them walk the plank. Rather, they were just kind of hustling like other ships and whatnot, getting supplies, getting money, who were just trying to make a living, essentially, who, they wanted to protect their family back home because that's what they were doing this for, right? Either way, at the time of his early life, it was during the Atlantic slave trade. This was when a lot of the Africans that we now see even today were coming over to the United States, the Americas, South America, working on cotton plantations, sugar plantations, etc. So given this and the fact that his home city, Bristol, was one of the biggest port cities in England, he had a lot of exposure to a lot of opportunity, whether that be learning seafaring, learning reading and writing, learning how to navigate, etc. And that's exactly what he did. Many historians actually believe that he may have come from a well-off family and had been well-educated. And we know for certain that he could read and write. It's believed that Teach served aboard a ship from a young age, and most likely a merchant vessel. And again, as I said prior, there's not a lot to know about his early life. So at this point, this is where he leaves England and he heads towards the Caribbean.
We don't even know what his real name was. So to say that this is all theory is exactly what it is. It's 100% theory, pretty much. We're just sort of giving... This information is really just historians' best guesses at what a potential story for him becoming the man he was ends up being. And, you know, I think that his ability to not only read, write, but also navigate effectively helps us paint the picture that he probably was pretty well educated. And, you know, Ashton said it best, and in the intro I touched on it as well. Like, the biggest business that's happening right now is, like, slave trade. So there's no good guys here. The people on the seas are hard men. And I think that that's sort of why he develops into being the man that he ends up being. And our best guess historically is that Blackbeard arrived in the Caribbean near the close of the 17th century, so right before the outbreak of the Spanish War of Succession, which went on from 1701 to 1714. So now that he's in the Caribbean, and if you say Caribbean or Caribbean, whatever, we're pretty much just going to say
it's
the
Caribbean, all right? If get it right.
And what's he doing, right? So what's he doing during this war? Well, he's privateering, and he's serving on the side of the British in this theater called the Queen Anne's War. And Ashton touched on privateers, but I'm going to get into exactly what a privateer was. So privateers were commonly used in combat because piracy was so normal at the time. Most merchant ships were armed, so they had cannons, and they were essentially, you know, totally capable of war. So during times of conflict, they would accept what was called a commission of war to fight for a certain country. So privateering was the main route to piracy because a lot of these sailors, as that commission of war ended, they were just out of work, right? And so the Queen, or, you know, Spain, France, or England would say to these merchant vessels, hey man, we'll pay you to fight the Spanish or the French under the flag. And, you know, a lot of the times they did not pay them at all, but they were just sort of allowed to keep all the bounty that they would be collecting. But this was a direct route into piracy for obvious reasons. You know, these guys start seeing way more profit by ambushing Spanish ships than they could have ever seen just transporting goods. So what do? They get into the rhythm, and then they keep doing this. And I think, you know, privateering, it's so interesting because, you know, I see often talks about private military contractors nowadays. So there's still, if you don't know, there's still tons of big private military companies. And people often act like it's some new thing. And by no means is war profiteering a new thing. This has been around forever. And privateering is one of the prime examples of that.
100%. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, like, paramilitary forces being around forever. Like, the fact that people, you know, they might look at it and be like, oh, this is ridiculous. How are they doing that? That's crazy. People are just being paid to go over there. It's like, yeah, I mean, if you were the King of England and France was acting up, and, you know, you could secretly pay this big band of mercenaries to go raise some hell in the French countryside and, you know, maybe disrupt them a little bit to aid your political position. You don't think you would? Do you think the king's going to be like, you know what, let's just send our guys over there with their insignias and sigils and shields of their houses, and the French will have no idea, bro? Of course there's commissions of war for, like, in paramilitary.
Yeah. Right? Well, it's crazy. I mean, the Dutch East India Company, which is one of the, you know, craziest stories ever, and I think we'll cover that in another episode, but they had a larger and more effective military than the Dutch did. So it's like, you know, because they had financial incentive to develop a force. So it's crazy, you know, money talks. And this is really, there's a cool quote where it's like, in a land without gold and booty, maybe we would have been heroes, or something like that, when it's referring to pirates, because this is really the driving factor for most piracy is money and, you know, freedom. And his privateering career would only last about 2.5 years, but during this time it was noted that he was incredibly bold and courageous. However, he was never given control of a ship. So the War of Spanish Succession would end, and Blackbeard was now out of work. What else then for a mercenary with a bold spirit to do than piracy?
All right, so now if you've ever wondered, like, have you ever pictured, like, the stereotypical pirate haven, you know, with the drunken brawls and the big burly dude with the big forearms and an eye patch and women and liquor, legal activity? Well, you've probably pictured where Blackbeard would end up next, which was Nassau, New Providence. And this place was one of you could say this was for inspiration for a lot of maybe what you'd see in Pirates of the Caribbean or other Disney movies, etc. Disney-esque kind of pirate havens, very animated characters walking around with their bandanas and scimitars and whatnot. So New Providence was an island in the Bahamas, about 300 kilometers off the coast of Florida. It was initially an English settlement, founded in 1684. However, after years of repeated attacks by the French and Spanish, and with no aid from a mainland English force, because bear in mind, this was the frontier at this point, the majority of the settlers were forced to leave in 1703. And at the time of Blackbeard, so 15 years later, there were around 500 settlers inhabiting the island, but they were sharing it with around 1,000 pirates. So were they, you know what I mean? Some neighbors, hey, right? So
it's crazy.
The location
business must have been booming, though.
Yeah, 100%. If you had like a tavern or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Or like, I don't know, like a dry cleaning service.
Or a brothel.
Yeah, there you go.
All of the above.
100%. Do it all in one. Go get your clothes cleaned, have a drink, and lay with someone. So the location of the island was it was very fortuitous for if you were a pirate or if you were a privateer or whatever you wanted to label yourself as. It was within close reach of the Florida Strait, which gave the pirates access to lucrative transatlantic shipping lanes from the European powers, which Riley had covered all of them, I think, except Portugal. Not only that, but the harbor of the island was capable of anchoring hundreds of pirate vessels. However, the larger vessels of the Royal Navy were unable to approach due to shallower waters. You can see how that's a bit of an advantage, right? You can have your sloops and all your smaller pirate ships, and that giant 250-ton Royal Navy boat with like 3 layers of cannons. He can't even come. He could sit there and watch you and be like off the coast, right? But he can't get in.
Not only that, is there's so many pirates there. It would take like a massive invasion force essentially to deal with this.
100%.
We were just touching on how the Dutch East India Company's navy was bigger than the Dutch's navy. So like what was this? There's 100 ships here up to. What Royal Navy fleet's coming in there? You would almost need, when they're simultaneously fighting the Spanish and the French. This is why these pirates are able to operate almost untouched, because no one has the resources to go after them right now. This is the golden age of piracy, right? The environment is so crazy and so tumultuous that no one's getting a fleet of 250 ships together to go after a bunch of pirates. That's not happening. That might happen later, but there's no way it's happening right now. These guys are essentially bulletproof in their pirate haven.
A quote that I really like that I found while doing the research to sum up the island of Providence was, "No city of homes, it was a place of temporary sojourn and refreshment for a literally floating population." And that was George Woodbury. So it was here in 1713 that Blackbeard would follow Benjamin Hornigold, a successful, here's that word again, privateer turned renowned pirate captain. So you're successful at privateering, might be successful as a pirate. Kind of the same thing. One of them is just legitimized by a badge by the crown, essentially. So from here, Hornigold and his crew, of which Blackbeard was most likely a part of, would attack Cuban plantations and other merchant vessels. Though at this point they didn't have their giant battleships. No, they would do it from periaguas, which were large open sailing canoes. That's right. They were attacking. They were pirating with canoes, right? So you get the Captain Jack Sparrow Pirates of the Caribbean giant pirate ship with the black flag out of your mind. No, these dudes were showing up with like imagine rolling up to like a U.S. military base and jacking an LAV in like a 1991 like neon green Toyota Corolla.
Well, actually, what is interesting, and if this doesn't sound believable to you, think about how pirates pirate today. What are they rocking?
True.
Just these tiny little fishing vessels that they're rolling up on, guys. Often, you have an advantage when you're more mobile, especially, being in these small island straits, where you can ambush guys pretty quickly, and they would have been able to conceal these little canoes. They would have been able to be very mobile, get into shallow waters, escape quite easily. You could just escape down some tiny little hole, and get away with these things. So, I mean, that would have offered them a lot of benefits as well. Yeah, there's a trade-off. And we actually see this as we go on that, Blackbeard ends up having to decide these trade-offs with mobility and small crews. and instead of having like a big fleet. I do find it crazy though that these guys are just pulling up on these like single mast, we're saying canoes. These aren't your like 2-3 person canoes that you like go for a little camping trip on. These are like proper like boats, and they have sails and they can deal with open waters. But at the end of the day, it's still pretty hilarious. They're by no means like armed with big cannons or Captain Jack Sparrowing it around. But through these tactics, within 17 months, they would amass nearly 60,000 pounds. So today that would be worth approximately 6.3 million pounds or 8.7 million US dollars. So with these funds, they would rid themselves of the periaguas and upgrade to sloops of war. So a sloop was a 1 mast sailing vessel, and a sloop of war was a 2 to 3 mast sailing vessel. So the sloops of war are proper combat ships. And a lot of privateering actually was done with sloops of war. And they're actually a really great intermediary between mobility and firepower. So the sloop of war is actually going to be, I think it's important to note, because it's actually going to be, in my opinion, really the pinnacle of the ship that Blackbeard does most of his piracy on. And we'll talk about his flagship later and the ship that he's known for. But if you actually look at his career, most of it was done with these sloops of war. And they're actually really interesting to me.
Yeah, so up to this point, this is where like the fog of history, that haze, that, where we kind of have to skirt around topics and be like, well, allegedly, hypothetically, theoretically, this is the consensus. Like, this is where that we can just blow it out of the water. And now we actually have some historical documents and legitimacy to whatever BS we're spouting at this point. It's not BS. Disclaimer, it is not BS. We are super serious here at Human Histories. So this is, it's now 1716, and Blackbeard officially, again, that word comes onto the historical record. Hornigold would grant him command of his own sloop of war, fitted with 8 guns and 90 men. And from here, they would go on to plunder and capture more booty, whether it be capturing a ship with 120 barrels of flour out of Havana, or the seizure of a sloop carrying 100 barrels of wine out of Bermuda. The pirates had an incredibly high tempo of these attacks, and they were consistently active. And this would actually continue. I mean, you'd have to be as well. Like $8.7 million USD, 60,000 pounds, right, in 17 months. Like, that is like imagine today. Imagine yourself 17 months ago, and now if today you were in control of $8 million. Like, what would you have had to do in that time, right? Like, if you don't have a legitimate business, you are getting after it, right? And that getting after it would continue until late 1717, and that's when Blackbeard would encounter the gentleman pirate. But before we get to that, it looked like Riley had something to say, so...
Well, it's just, I think that something that people forget when we talk about... Like, I love the idea of the everyday man. So a lot of times when we talk about history, we talk about who we're going to talk about here, Stede Bonnet, we talk about Blackbeard, we talk about Hornigold, right? We talk about all the leaders, but we forget that these men were somehow amassing crews of 300 men between them, right? Why is that? Why are these things happening?
Paycheck?
And I touched on, what's that?
Paycheck?
Exactly. But it really is. This is a time where life is not nearly as complicated as it might be today. And for a lot of these guys, these men that would have just lived on the seas, they don't have families back home. Most of them would have just been poor men that had found a job. And now that job's bringing in serious cash. And it's not like, I touched on it before, it's not like they're morally like, oh no, I'm not transporting slaves around anymore. Like, they don't have any attachment. And they were just fighting against the Spanish and the French 5 minutes ago for the Queen. So now let's say they're still targeting the same vessels. They're not even fighting different enemies, etc., etc. And they're living a quite lavish life, you can assume. And often, and we'll see in this story as well, they don't understand why the single captain wouldn't just go grab a bunch of money and get out of there, which often did happen. But for the most part, they had a massive crew to keep happy. And that was not going to be cheap. Can you imagine running 3 massive ships nowadays? Just think of the cost. $8.7 million. Compare that to running 3 large warships today with 300 men aboard. That actually wouldn't last you very long. So they got to keep moving. They got to keep moving and grooving.
Especially considering that they can't have planes dropping supplies into the ocean beside them so they can scoop up and bring it on board, or helicopters from offshore coming and bringing them all their food and their clean water, right? Like, yeah, these guys were like Riley said earlier, man, they were hard, man. They were grinding like out on the high seas.
Except for one man. And that man was Stede Bonnet.
Perfect transition.
He actually was an esteemed and wealthy man from a family of a Barbados sugar planters. And he arrived in Nassau. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, who for some reason decided to hire a crew of 126 and turn to piracy. And some suggest that it was a means to escape an unhappy marriage, as he and his wife had 3 kids at home. You know, some things never change, I guess. But others think that he might have been mentally unstable or whatever.
A little kooky.
Yeah. I think that he definitely might have romanticized piracy a little bit. But he was...
You see that so much in history, hey? Like the people, like the artist or the painter, like the guy who... Like, you saw this a lot in the early 19th century, right? Like, look at Ernest Hemingway and even... George Orwell, for example. George Orwell, like, he served in like the Spanish Revolution and stuff like that. He was like a journalist and all that. Like, you see that. Sorry, just to get tangential. I know we were just getting right back into the story, but I just can't help but think of that, like how easy it is to romanticize conflict, right? And I mean, hey man, I'm even guilty of it as well. But like, I think for me, like I think a big part of it, and you could speak to this, like I romanticize the thought of going into combat and thought of military. What I think of first and foremost is the camaraderie, right? Like the esprit de corps. I know we've touched on this before, but it's just interesting how that happens in men. And I feel like it happens more often with men, though it certainly does happen with women.
There's no question that it happens way, way, way more often with men. And it's funny that I actually disagreed with the historians when I was doing this research. I actually disagree that it was just he was crazy. Because I actually think that in a time like this, pirates would have been talking, you know, in hushed tones and about this freedom, and they would have been recruiting left, right, and center. You would have known someone that was a pirate now. And I think that it very well could have been that he was just, like Ashton said, he just got soaked up in it and wanted to do it. And it was like a midlife crisis for him. And next thing you know, he's in Nassau with 126 men and a sloop of war. Right, so I don't think that it's some crazy idea that he went to piracy, you know, and I actually know that a lot of historians lack the, you know, historians often have a very analytical brain, and a lot of them lack the imaginative thinking, but Stede Bonnet definitely did not lack imaginative thinking because he thought he was going to be some great pirate, and his story is hilarious in my opinion, because he's not really relevant, but he's a fun side story that we wanted to touch on. Well, upon arriving at Nassau, it was discovered that he had narrowly escaped an encounter with a Spanish military vessel, and he'd lost about 1/3 of his crew, and nearly lost his own life. He was also almost captured. And learning this, the pirates at Nassau allowed him sanctuary, conditionally. He was to turn command of his vessel, the Revenge, over to Blackbeard. He complied, and Blackbeard was now in full control of his own ship. Between Hornigold and Blackbeard, they now possessed 3 ships. With these now increased capabilities, it follows that their tempo and success would increase proportionately.
So yeah, during October of 1717, Blackbeard and his flotilla would terrorize the American East Coast, capturing 15 or more vessels. The pirates would strip the ships of their valuables, throw the cargo into the sea. Some of the sloops or ships they kept. Some of them they either scuttled or let run aground. Scuttle is when you basically poke holes in the hull. Not literally poke holes. You're blowing holes in the hull, and you're allowing the ship to sink. Run aground, that's self-explanatory. The crews of the ships that surrendered were often allowed to leave. This, as a result, left many scattered former captains and crews flowing into the capitals of Philadelphia and New York, bemoaning their fate at the hands of the new tyrant of the seas, Blackbeard. And this point right here, I think, is a very poignant one, and one that it's kind of a recurring theme in the story of Blackbeard, in the sense that they're Robin Hood-esque figures, pirates are. Like, when you look back at history, it's often written from the point of the establishment, right? It's written from the perspective of the monarchists or the governors or the ship captain hunting down this. Either way, they're all part of this bigger establishment. So you have men like Blackbeard and his cadre that are, in their eyes, as Riley said, hushed tones, freedom fighters, like we can live a better life, and etc., who are going out and they're endeavoring to make this for themselves, but they're looked at as if they're these malicious, awful, evil men, which, you know, there's a heavy propagandistic element to that, you know, you want to convince the layman that this man that you might look at as a symbol of hope is actually, you know, just an absolute degen, and that, you know, he's no good for anybody. He's just an outlaw, tyrant of civilization. When in reality, it's likely that you might have a space aboard his ship where you'd have, you know, you'd have friends, you'd have food, and you'd have a life of adventure, right? And it's kind of like, to get to the point, like, Blackbeard was not recorded ever killing or harming deliberately another human until his final encounter, which had inevitably led to his death. It makes sense. You back an animal into a corner, right? The animal's not just going to lay down. So, like, to give you that idea, like, think of how many ships he captured in 1 month, in the month of October. 15 ships. And now let's just say, just throw out random numbers. There's 15 men per ship, or 30 men per ship, and you capture 15 of them. That's what is that, 400 and something people that you don't damage. You just let them walk off as long as they give you your stuff. Like, they weren't murderers, right? They weren't bloodthirsty. They weren't out to terrorize people as much as they were just to enrich themselves, right? And they weren't enriching themselves off the backs of the layman. They were enriching themselves off the backs of those within the establishment, right? The militaries, the monarchies, the governments, etc. It's not like they were going inland to a town and knocking on doors, you know, break and enter and stealing somebody's tea, right? They were taking it from that British vessel or that Portuguese vessel.
Yeah, and Ashton touched on it. You know, there is always that air of propaganda, and also if you get your ship captured by Blackbeard, it is beneficial for you to say that he was this literal demon coming towards you, and you had no option other than to surrender.
The ego,
so
right?
It's exactly right. It's double. Not only does the establishment want to make sure that people don't go and become more pirates, but they also want to. The people getting getting their stuff stolen, they want to make sure that people know that it's by Satan himself, and there was no way they could have stopped him. And this is likely where the terrifying image of Blackbeard originated. So allegedly, Blackbeard would adorn himself with a brace hung over his shoulders. In it, there would be 3 pistols per side, a total of 6. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and an incredibly long beard. And honestly, I've always thought the 6 pistols is so gangster. Oh, you know, now you'd have 1 revolver, but this guy literally had 6 pistols just strapped on him at all times.
One doesn't work, just throws it overboard, grabs another.
Yeah, it's so gangster. So even though he often had, you know, just didn't blow holes in the side of enemy vessels, he would just sort of go and take them and they would surrender instantly. We do have records of fascinating tactics which Blackbeard may have utilized. So some of these tactics would be that he would put fuses under his hat, 4 of them, spiraling out like the tendrils of his skull. He would light them when approaching opposing vessels. This would give the image of a devilish man surrounded by smoke. Intimidation was certain. This begged the question, was Blackbeard truly a malicious entity sent from the bowels of hell to torture the civilized, or was he a cunning pirate who had an exceptional ability to use image to his advantage? After all, would it not be easier to achieve wealth without fighting? Well, that's exactly what Blackbeard did. Often, many of those he approached surrendered at the mere sight of him, and it was not until his last stand, which we'll see, is when he actually had to do some fighting. Yeah, but that's also not to say that he had never seen combat.
Yeah.
Because he was a privateer before this. So he's experienced in combat, but I think that his years on the sea before going to piracy really taught him how to make money without having to fight. You know, it's if he's getting into gunfights for each of these encounters, his ships would be damaged, his crew would be injured and wounded. Like, it would be massively not beneficial for him. So getting good at intimidation was a key.
And yeah, so intimidation was absolutely like one of those biggest tactics, right? Like if you don't, you know, that's why when you go to the bar, which I know none of us have been to in a year because of COVID. When you go to the bar and you see the bouncer and he's some 6'7" dude with tattoos and he's just yoked, right? You're like, all right, man, I'll keep it together. All right, it's a big man. So you know that's kind of Blackbeard on the seas. He's that big man with tattoos by the door. So during mid to late November of 1717, Blackbeard would make his next move. Him and his crew would encounter a French merchant vessel traveling towards the Windward Islands, northeast of Venezuela. a large ship, a frigate actually, weighing nearly 250 tons. So this is kind of the same kind of family of ships that we were talking about the Royal Navy has, just huge, massive. And it had gun ports for up to 40 cannons. Fortunately for Blackbeard, however, it was a slave ship, so, you need room. The armaments had been stripped and left in France to accommodate the 500-something slaves being carried below deck. This fact, in tandem with the state of the frigate's crew, left it vulnerable. And the captain of the ship being named the La Concorde, knew this as well, and they surrendered to Blackbeard immediately upon seeing him. Of the 460 slaves remaining, Blackbeard would enlist, if you could call it that, 61 of them. And it's uncertain to us the criteria used to choose these men, but what we do know for certain is that pirates like Blackbeard welcomed Africans. The social hierarchies upon pirate ships were surprisingly progressive. Your background didn't matter as much as your capabilities did, right? So if you could contribute to his crew, you could help him, you could keep everybody alive, and you could help everybody get a little bit richer. Yeah, who cares if you're black or Portuguese or, Brazilian, etc. Blackbeard would provide a sloop. Again, this is going back to that clemency thing. He would provide a sloop for the previous captain of this frigate so that he might ferry the remainder of the slaves and his crew to shore. So from here, that's before we get on. Actually, I just want to mention that quickly again. It kind of reinforces that Robin Hood thing again. All the primary countries are involved in pulling these people out of their country and taking them away to essentially a life of damnation, working a field with no say, stripping them of their personal autonomy. And then you have these pirates who are supposedly, in the eyes of these monarchies, and the worst people alive. But they're liberating these men, right? They're liberating these men, and they're giving them opportunity, and they're treating them as equals. They're not treating them as second rate due to the color of their skin. I think that's so fascinating. This episode's one of those episodes full of our anecdotes, but to have so much experience and exposure to so many different types of people, and yet you'd think that's why it makes sense, right? Like, as a pirate, you deal with so many different types of people, so of course you're far less concerned about the color of one's skin, because you recognize everybody as either just a man or a woman, right? You don't see that boundary the same way some white dude from England who's part of the aristocracy and looks down upon even his own people would.
Yeah, it's actually cool, and hopefully we'll cover this another day in another podcast, but there's a lot of successful women pirates. There was a lot of successful black pirates, like all the above. And it's interesting, it would have obviously been anecdotal, the treatment based on the captains and their experiences and what they believed at the time. But overall, they were surprisingly progressive. Do we know that if they treated them exactly like equals? No, we don't know that. But I mean, their fate was slavery or actual freedom, So it's actually... yeah, it's weird. It's a weird twist of fate, and I think that it actually helps demonstrate who these men were. They were very you could say they were anti-establishment, right? They served themselves, and I think that that's what really drew them to piracy, was the ability to serve themselves and just to do, whatever they wanted, probably for the first time in their entire lives, especially when you come from poverty and you are just sort of doing whatever you can to get by. Now you're sort of living above your means, right? You're actually, quote unquote, successful, whatever that means, right?
Yeah, I think that would apply to everybody that aboards one of those ships as part of the crew, hey? Like, not just...
Yeah, I mean, people have the idea that the layman was successful in the 1800s or something. No. 99% of people were barely scraping by. Life was so hard.
And that's what I think is I get a kick out of, right? It's like when people talk about a historical oppression of women by men, etc. More certainly it happened, obviously, but more often than not, it was men and women both being oppressed by the rich, right? The aristocracy, under heel, the serfs, the poor people, the peasantry, everybody was kind of getting screwed unless you had a bunch of money, right?
So from here, Blackbeard would anchor this ship and immediately rename it the Queen Anne's Revenge. He would have this crew retrofit the ship, outfitting it with the cannons that it so deserved, and he had taken a massive leap, and he was prepared to wreak even more havoc upon the Caribbean. So now this is the famous Queen Anne's Revenge, which is just a historical ship, and they've actually found the ship. You can look up where they found it, which is pretty cool. I think they confirmed that they found it. They confirmed that it was the Queen Anne's Revenge about 15 years ago. It's pretty incredible. And this is a proper ship. You know, the Queen Anne's Revenge has 40 cannons. It was carrying almost 600 people by the time Blackbeard got it. Think about that. That's like a small town aboard a ship. That's the population of Nassau on one ship. So this is a proper vessel. And now he's got that along with a couple sloops. And from December 1717 to around May of 1718, Blackbeard's movements weren't known with complete clarity. But there are some things that he did have record of doing. Of this, there are too many instances, but they all follow the same pattern. He would lead his flotilla around the outer arc of the Caribbean, terrorizing port cities, merchant fleets, and European powers' forts, and at this point, he was seemingly unstoppable and widely feared. However, in late December 1717, Blackbeard would receive some incredible information. King George I had decreed that all crimes committed by pirates prior to January 5th, 1718 would be nullified, and that they would receive a full pardon. This agreement also permitted the pirates who sought clemency to keep the spoils they had amassed. To some, this was alluring, people like Hornigold, but not to Blackbeard.
Yeah, and prior to this news, Blackbeard and Hornigold were separated, with Blackbeard the primary captain and Steed as his secondary now. But upon hearing of the pardon, Hornigold would sail for Jamaica with the Ranger, which was his ship, and another smaller vessel, and he'd receive his pardon. Here he would actually turn from pirate to pirate hunter, go figure, whatever pays, right? Unfortunately, we would never receive a Hollywood-esque standoff between Hornigold and Blackbeard, as Hornigold would not catch Blackbeard prior to his death. An interesting fact about Hornigold, actually, when Riley touched on it earlier about how these privateers, maybe you'd be enlisted by the English to go after the Portuguese or the French or the Spanish. Hornigold was actually a privateer for the English, but after privateering for the English, he went to piracy, but he would never attack British ships. And this was actually something that led to, I wouldn't say, it wasn't a mutiny, essentially, but it was mutinous behavior by his crews, because, you see these British ships laden with loot, and you always say, nah, we'll go for the next one, right? Well, what if the next one is always subpar compared to the one that you could have just had, but you don't because of your former allegiances, right? So it almost seemed kind of like a matter of time until, something like this was going to come up where he would try to flip sides again, right? And you see that at the moment he did.
Yeah, but this does actually, King George's bid here to just give pirates a free ride. Like, he's not going to penalize them if they say we're done. That really is a great demonstration as to just how powerful the pirates are at this point, right? Like, he's acknowledging that he can't really fight these dudes. And this move allows, which sucks, right? Because they've stolen so much from all these countries. So to them, it's like, it's a big knock. That's a big loss. But they just know there's no real other way to deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, should we go and spend even more resources to try to capture these elusive dudes, or should we just say, hey, you know what, like, you guys have got your wealth, and that's another thing, they could keep their wealth, right? Everything they had amassed. So basically, he's saying, like Riley just said, all that stuff you stole from the English, you can keep it, man. We don't care. Just stop harassing us, right? Just leave us alone, right?
Just don't steal anymore.
Exactly. And this actually, I don't know if it necessarily paid off. There are a lot of the people who did take the pardon would just end up right back into piracy not long after. Difference being, it actually, looking back historically, it may have been a tactic, because they were sending, and you learn this from Blackbeard, they were actually sending, the British were sending a massive fleet. Like, they were sending tons and tons of ships over to the Caribbean at this point to fight piracy. But there was a window of time that they would have had to buy some time, right? So now, if you sent over this giant military force, and it's going to take them 14 months or however long it takes, 8 months to get across the sea, and they finally get over there, well, you're thinking, okay, well, if they're not going to reach till August and it's January, right? Obviously, he would have had to plan this far in advance because, there's no telephone lines or email. So you say, hey, on this date, we're going to give them clemency and we're going to launch this fleet. This fleet will arrive at this point. So through this 8-month period, maybe the tempo will slow down, and by the time they start realizing that this isn't all it's cut out to be and it picks up, well, now we're going to have the means to fight them over there, right? So if you think of it in that way, that just kind of dawned on me. That actually makes a lot of sense. However, with many of Blackbeard's former associates returning to the side of the quotation civilized, Blackbeard did what any sensible pirate would do. He hung up his hat, he immediately sailed for Jamaica, he received his pardon, and that's the end. Obviously not. He doubled down, increasing both the frequency and intensity of his pirate operations. After all, there were now more targets and less competition. So at this point, in January of 1718, Blackbeard would disappear from the written record. As we alluded to earlier, there's a little bit of it's a little mystified as to what was going on with him, right? However, we have records of specific events that occurred within the time frame that he was gone, air quotations, all within the area that he would have been operating, and all akin to his type of behavior. So while we can't say with 100% historical accuracy and pin it directly on Blackbeard, we can paint a picture with a high degree of certainty. You know, if Blackbeard leaves a mark on the wall every time he goes and does something, and, you know, nobody's seen Blackbeard there, but that mark is on the wall, you can kind of guess, right? You can kind of guess, oh, hey, that must have been Blackbeard. So what exactly was this elusive big man getting up to?
According to records and letters found within the British Historical Archives, we learned that Blackbeard was out hunting for bigger fish. How big, you ask? Well, he was scouring the coasts near Mexico for the largest naval military vessel in the Western Hemisphere, a British frigate known as the Adventure. Rumor has it that while on the search for this specific ship, he was also on the hunt for the Diamond, a ship belonging to the King of Britain. So he's pretty ambitious, to say the least. He's going after some big fish. And you know what? Maybe he's using this as a last-ditch effort to get the big fish and then get out. But we don't know that, because the fact that he even had a general idea of where British military vessels were located indicates that Blackbeard was not just a skilled pirate, but he clearly had some degree of intelligence network in place. I actually do think that's cool. That's a good point to mention, because the ocean is not a small place. So for him to be specifically hunting certain ships, you really got to have a network of guys that know what's going on.
It's smart too, right? Because like he's their prey. So, you know, now the prey becomes the hunter, right? Yeah,
and if you can get the jump on them, that's especially with naval warfare. It's often when it's piracy and stuff like this, the reason pirates are so effective is because they're choosing when to engage, right? And they're finding these guys along their shipping routes or wherever they're at, and they're not these big naval flotillas. So they're always massively outnumbering their enemies. That's why, you know, if you got one boat and you're puttering around, doesn't matter how armed up it is. If 3, 4, 5 pirate vessels come at you, you're going to surrender, right? There's no point in fighting.
Yeah, I mean, perfectly like a point to really hammer home what you said is like, and I can relate 100% when I'm seafaring on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you know? You always got to ram them first.
Exactly. Unfortunately for Blackbeard, he would not succeed in his hunt. Be it that he quit too soon or favor was simply not on his side. He had to return to normal piracy. He had spent the months of February, March, and April plundering ships amongst the islands off the coast of Honduras and Belize, and all he had to show for it was molasses and wood. Even though he had captured an incredible number of vessels in this time, the wealth was not proportionately represented. He allegedly had run low on funds and liquor and had an unhappy crew on his hands. He needed to act, and fast. From here, he would head north. This is what I was touching on, where it's not like there's some infinite supply of money for his 300-man crew, right? This is a lot of mouths to feed. And they're here because they want to live lavishly and live the life of a pirate, right? So, yeah, by no means is not being successful a long-term strategy. And what he does next is incredibly bold. So, fill us in, Ashton.
So Blackbeard had sailed towards, this is where we're getting back to the United States, or the colonies at this point. So Blackbeard had sailed towards Charlestown, South Carolina. Before we get there, I just have to mention, I think it's so crazy. Like when researching this and looking at maps, I was like, wait, you're telling me that South Virginia or South Carolina is that close to the Caribbean? It is. It's like 500 kilometers. Really not that far away, right? So for a ship that might be able to travel, you know, I don't even know how many kilometers. Like based off what we learned in that episode on Battle of Marathon, a simple trireme could go up to 100 kilometers in one day, and that's with oars, right? Like a 3-mast, 3-sail ship could probably go a couple 100 kilometers in a day, most likely,
depending on the wind, for sure.
Yeah, and the weight, right? But yeah, so he had sailed towards Charlestown, South Carolina, and on the way he would sack and capture 3 more vessels, further bolstering his powerful navy. So once arrived, what did he do? Well, he blockaded them, which is pretty crazy to think. That's a military maneuver, but a pirate did it. So a blockade was in place, and he would seize every ship that had attempted to either enter or leave the port. And he succeeded in doing this for 2 reasons. Number one, the city had no guard ship, and which is basically just a ship that would go out in there and fight people, and he was uncontested. And number 2, he had captured the pilot ship upon his arrival, which was a ship used to ferry captains and crew to and from their vessels. So this rendered those upon the water sitting ducks, and those within the city pacified onlookers. So they had no security force, and they had no method of getting these people on or off the ships. So he was pretty smart. He was definitely a tactician. He definitely thought. He was a thinker about his actions. So allegedly, of the ships he seized, there were lackluster spoils. So the ever sensible man he was, Blackbeard decided, well, what's precious cargo if I can't find any? Well, humans. So he gathered hostages. The ship Crowley held many important people, councilmen of South Carolina and other nobles headed for London. A lucky break, Blackbeard would capture them and hold them until his demands were met. A chest of medicine for him and his men. The councilmen on the ship had agreed, and so he sent 2 pirates and one of the hostages, a man named Mr. Marks, to land. They sent them to land to fetch this medicine. This is a bit of a funny little incident, and it's kind of like, it's very pirate-esque, I'd say. What do you think?
This is the definition of pirate-esque. Yeah, for sure. Because there would be a difficult and tense few days for those he had captured. Before their departure, Blackbeard had threatened them. They must return with the medicine within 2 days, lest the hostages be executed. And on the first foray into town, the ship they were on had capsized, eating time off of the clock. When notified of this, Blackbeard relented and allowed 2 more days to bring the medicine. The 2 days passed, and with no word from Mr. Marks, Blackbeard became agitated. After a brief meeting with his crew, they decided on intimidation. They moved 8 ships dangerously close to the harbor, causing panic to erupt within the city. Fortunately for the captors, the man sent to retrieve the goods had returned with a story to boot. Upon arrival in town, and after having acquired the goods, Mr. Marks sought to return, but he could not find the 2 pirates he had set out with. As luck would have it, they would turn up drunk, of course. They had run into some acquaintances within the city and decided to live a little. Now that he had the medicine chest, Blackbeard would allow his prisoners to go free. Not without relieving them of their personal belongings and some of their clothing. He had gotten what he wanted out of the blockade and would now leave Charlestown. This is like the definition of piracy, because these guys he sends into town, keep in mind, he says, okay, you got 2 days. The 2 days is up, and Mr. Marks can't find these pirate guys.
Blackbeard's like sitting there like this.
Yeah, but Blackbeard just doesn't kill Blackbeard waits, right? Because I think he knows, okay, my crew isn't exactly the most reliable guys on the planet Earth, and now they're in Charlestown having a laugh. And thankfully he doesn't kill anyone, and he waits, and then they come back with the medicine. But it did crack me up that these guys, like, they didn't exactly take their timeline as law.
Dude, I could see that as being like a black and white movie. Like, you see like the goofiness, like the guy walking and then stumbles and trips and stuff. Like, and so from here, after that little Hollywood-esque incidents in Charlestown, they would sail even further north to Beaufort Inlet or Topsail Inlet, both of the same thing, which was off the coast of North Carolina. And once arrived, this is where it gets interesting. He had ordered his men to careen the ships, which was an act of running the ship aground during high tide, so that once the water had receded, they were able to clean the part of the ship that usually remains below the waterline, right? Get off all the barnacles, etc. There would be trouble, however, and both his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and a smaller sloop would run too far, having their masts break, and now they were irretrievable and lost. Only a small Spanish sloop and the ship of the gentleman pirate, Stede Bonnet, Revenge, remained. And this is something we're probably going to talk about briefly, but there's speculation as to whether or not the destruction of these ships was intentional. Blackbeard had amassed a fleet, and with it many men. And on this particular day, he had 300 with him. That's a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of payments to hand out. And knowing how easily it was, and bear in mind, not all these men were his men. Stede Bonnet had a lot of men, and Stede Bonnet was rolling with him, right? So Stede Bonnet was subordinate to Blackbeard, but those men may have been loyal to Stede Bonnet first and foremost, right? Anyway, Knowing how easy it was for mutinies to arise and having seen the potential for it firsthand during the rough time just a few months prior, it's highly likely that Blackbeard did do this intentionally, and his further actions, in our opinion, my opinion, and I think Riley shares it, solidify that speculation.
I mean, let's break this down. Blackbeard, who's been at sea his entire adult life, commanding ships now for years, somehow messes up and careens his most important boat on land. It just doesn't add up. Stede Bonnet, his crew is probably a bit upset that we haven't got what we were promised, or, whatever it is. And not just that, but Blackbeard, he's working with pirates, so it's not like they're not prone to mutiny. I think you've got probably the most mutiny-prone crew on the planet Earth. And he's got this massive crew, and the bigger your crew, the bigger your ships, the more mouths to feed. And it's becoming, like we sort of touched on, he hasn't been making a ton of money recently. So it's sort of like a cost versus military ability
capability,
deal,
like
right?
a cost versus capability.
Exactly,
yeah.
right? Okay. So can I do what I'm doing right now with half the amount of ships and half the amount of guys? Probably. So he ditches these ships, and having only 2 ships remaining, Blackbeard had to make a decision. So what did he decide? Well, the pardon wasn't looking so bad now. So he did what any reasonable man would do, and he sent someone else to test the waters. Stede Bonnet would immediately set out on a small sailboat with a small group of men to Bathtown, North Carolina. Upon arrival, he would be granted his pardon. Stede would return to the Beaufort Inlet to collect his ship, Revenge. Once he had arrived, he became aware of Blackbeard's treachery. Many of his men had been left marooned, and the Revenge was stripped of its provisions and armaments. Stede would set out to capture Blackbeard, but like Hornigold, would fail to. He would return to piracy, being captured and hung 4 short months later. I think that's kind of funny about Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, is he actually only was a pirate for about 4 months on his own. Like, he only ever actually managed to properly captain a ship for about 4 months before getting captured and hung. So Stede Bonnet was a bit of a clown.
Yeah,
I think that we sort of covered that earlier.
I'm better. I can take on Blackbeard.
Yeah, dude, I'm gonna go get him.
Can't believe he did this to my boys, man.
But I mean, his purpose was served, right? And Blackbeard recognized, okay, I'm actually gonna get this pardon, and he goes to Bath.
Yeah. And so once arrived there in Bath, Blackbeard would convene with the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, and get a little politicking in here. During their meeting, they would come to an agreement. Blackbeard and his men would receive a pardon and also settle in Bath. So this arrangement, while it seems a little, so you're saying they have to live there? Like, why would you want pirates to live there? Good question. So this arrangement would prove to be mutually beneficial. Bath, being a newly established colony, was a frontier town. Having only a few more than 24 homes and 100 residents, the town was perpetually under threat from the local indigenous. And having Blackbeard's men settle with him nearly doubled the town's population overnight, as well as providing a well-armed and combat-tested potential militia. That is to say nothing of the vast wealth brought by Blackbeard, which certainly aided in stimulating the local economy. It is easy to see why Eden and Blackbeard became quick acquaintances. So if you happen to live in North Carolina and you know people from that area, Bathtown area, and maybe they're your family members, congratulations. It's likely you have pirate lineage, and I'm going to give you a little clap. It's pretty cool. I'm just a dude who has a mixed pot of Ukrainian, Russian, and Irish, and I would kill to have some pirate lineage. So North Carolina represent. During July and August, Blackbeard would regularly make trips back to his sloop, the Adventure, in the Ocracoke Inlet. He kind of parked it. Remember, he took one ship because there was the Revenge left and a little sloop. So he's like, I'll just take my sloop. We did fine with this before. Charles Eden would provide official title of the ship to Blackbeard, legitimizing him as its owner. This stability in Blackbeard's life and for his crew would not last long. However, they would receive permission to, it wouldn't last long, like this newfound kind of quaint life, as they would get right back after it, as Charles Eden would grant them a commission of war for privateering.
So by the end of August, regardless of the privateering commission, Blackbeard would return to piracy. And he had captured 2 French vessels laden with goods. He would combine their crew into one and demand they sail immediately back for France. Then he would return to Bath with the plundered booty. Allegedly, Blackbeard would set out in the dark of night to Bath, accompanied by gifts for Charles Eden and Tobias Knight, North Carolina's Chief Justice. He would deliver them, and the following day, Charles Eden would declare that the story Blackbeard had for how he had obtained the goods was legitimate, and that he had found the ship abandoned at sea. Blackbeard would keep the remainder of the plunder after providing his cut to North Carolina authorities. He had effectively set up a system similar to that of Nassau, only now with the law on his side. So this is actually really clever, because he goes to Bath and he gets a pardon. And we said that he returns to piracy, but he doesn't just blatantly return to piracy. He secretly returns to piracy. So he has a commission of war. He's only attacking enemy ships, but he's sort of attacking whoever he wants. And then he's coming back and giving a cut to these authorities. And then they make up this story that, no, that was legit, man. He found that boat floating around at sea. No one was on it.
They hit him first. I saw it.
Yeah, whatever it was, he's making it so that his very illegal acts are now within the law, right? And, if you listen to I think it was our second or third episode about Billy the Kid, in this time of frontier towns, like the law and the chief justices, it's such a paper thin line of justice. Like, it's not by any stretch of the imagination a functioning system. So this was recognized by a lot of other authorities within the colonies as well. And while he may have had the authorities of North Carolina in his pocket, there were other governors in the region that had their eye on him. And one of these such men was Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, which was a much larger and wealthier province. And he would put out a warrant of arrest for Blackbeard.
Yeah, so this is where our favorite pirate begins to, this is where the coalesce, like where his doom begins to coalesce. So Alexander Spotswood would send out 2 sloops to find and capture Blackbeard, but find no success. So he just stopped. No. From here, he would begin apprehending many pirates within Virginia who had connections to Blackbeard, obtaining valuable information of his whereabouts, as well he had set up an espionage network within North Carolina, keeping tabs on the activities of Blackbeard. Bear in mind, at this point in time, as Riley just alluded to with the law, kind of like we've made this joke so many times about like an animal farm, like, yeah, bro, you're legal, but I'm like more legal. So like, you know what I mean? Like some people, you got justice down, man, but I am justice. So,
Yeah. And it's like for Virginia's much bigger, much more established. So, in Spotswood's opinion, he's like, okay, sure, but who cares what the guys in North Carolina think? Yeah. He's like, you guys are the law, but I'm the law.
Yeah, exactly.
So he would eventually succeed in his efforts, and he would discover the general area of which Blackbeard was residing, which is Ocracoke Inlet.
Before we go on, I just wanted to say, like, all of that, like, well, we're going to get to this further when we talk more about what he finally did, but like building an espionage network and sending these sloops and these little interrogation tactics, this was all illegal. Like, this was like off the books. You're not supposed to be doing this. Like imagine, like, I'm a grocery manager, right, at a store. So imagine I went over to one of the other departments and I just started like changing things, ordering things, taking things apart, right? It's kind of what he's doing here. It's like, what are you doing, man? Like, this isn't your jurisdiction. Like, take a step back, right? He doesn't care because, like Riley said, he's the guy sitting there with his belt buckle out, like, you know what I mean? Yosemite
and
Sam.
it's very uncharacteristic of a country like America, which never has any beef between its states or its.
No, they get along super well.
Yeah, they've never seen they didn't ever go to war with each other, did they?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so, but Spotswood, he's blatantly breaking the law. Right? He's not allowed to be setting up an espionage network within another American state, right? But that's exactly what he's doing. So yeah, it is interesting, and it really just shows the power dynamic of the time, right? And how these individual leaders, he's not scared of getting caught by the North Carolina authorities. He's like, oh, what are you going to do? Catch me? Whatever. I'm bigger and more powerful than you. Like, what are you going to do? Come arrest me? So Spotswood's a really motivated guy, and he doesn't like having Blackbeard around. It really upsets him that his ships are at threat of Blackbeard because, like we said, Blackbeard's, he's back to regular piracy at this point. But Spotswood's ambitious and resilient person, and he doesn't give up. And now he found where Blackbeard is. So, what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, Spotswood would dispatch a raid on the pirate base on Ocracoke Island. As Riley just covered, basically, they held North Carolina with disdain. They're like, oh, this is a backwater. We don't care about them. So he probably didn't really fear any repercussions from his actions. But anyway, he would dispatch an overland expedition as well as a British naval force under the command of Maynard, which was one of his lieutenants. He hired 2 privateering vessels, the Jane and the Ranger. They share a lot of names. This we've seen 3 ships named the Ranger and 2 named the Adventure. Anyway, he would pay for it with his own money, so not governmental funds, but out of pocket. That kind of goes to show that this is a personal vendetta. And he would purchase ships or pay for ships that could operate in shallow waters. However, this also prevented the ships from carrying weapons, so the British soldiers would have to rely on their personal weapons to fight. So it would have to be a boarding mission. And on the morning of November 22nd, 1718, Maynard's ship moved on Blackbeard at Ocracoke Island. But to their dismay, they ran aground, losing them and the element of surprise. Blackbeard took this opportunity to make a run for it, but before he could, one of Maynard's ships was able to get loose and close it on Blackbeard. Blackbeard apparently shouted that he would neither give or take quarter and let loose a volley on both of Maynard's ships. This killed the captain of the Ranger, but the Jane was mostly unharmed. Maynard quickly thought to hide his men below deck, which is really smart, kind of a Trojan horse kind of thing, and leave only the pilot aboard. And remember that the Jane has absolutely no cannons. So Blackbeard would fall for the trap, thinking the Jane was an easy target. He closed in, boarded her, and the trap was set. Maynard and his sailors rushed to meet Blackbeard on the deck. They stormed out from the below deck. What is that called? I don't know. Anyway, they stormed out from below deck where they were concealed and engaged Blackbeard and his crew. And bear in mind, at this point, Blackbeard had marooned most of his crew. They were all gone, right? So maybe he had 30 men, if that. The fighting was brutal, but swift. Blackbeard fought valiantly, but after being shot 5 times and slashed another 20, he would succumb to his wounds and die there in Ocracoke Inlet at the hands of Alexander Spotswood's mercenaries. So quite a riveting story, kind of fascinating, kind of all over the place. It's really we've said the word so many times, but Robin Hood-esque, right? Like that quote you said earlier, like, in a world without gold, we might have been heroes, right? Like that's profound when you think of it in the sense that they really kind of are fighting against injustice in many ways, right? Like the illegal trade and slavery, etc. Like they're giving the poor, they're giving the peasantry, they're giving the downtrodden opportunity to make a name for themselves, some wealth upon their ships. Albeit at the expense of the establishments. But, personally, I listen to a ton of Rage Against the Machine, so I'm kind of on board with it. No pun intended. But what are your thoughts, Riley?
Yeah, I am happy that, this story, and just to really summarize as well, and this didn't last long. Blackbeard was really only prevalent for a few years, and yet we still talk about him to this day. And I think that the way he went out is one of the reasons we still talk about him to this day. Because, like we touched on, he wasn't actually going and just massacring people and killing people aboard ships. He was doing none of that. But when he died with his 6 pistols blasting, 5 shots, and 20 slashes. He went out swinging. And that really sort of solidified the story of Blackbeard.
The myth.
Yeah, the myth and the tale, right? Which is really what this is. And I think that maybe if we sounded a bit tangential this podcast and we were a bit all over the place is sort of because we wanted to paint a picture that balanced that myth with reality. And reality is not nearly as storytale-esque as we would like it to be.
Yeah, if we were to just read the script verbatim and just no color commentary, congratulations, you listened to a 9-minute podcast. And we hope you enjoyed it. So,
but to me, man, do I agree that pirates were Robin Hood-esque? I'm gonna be honest, man, I don't really agree with that because I think that they were very self-serving. But in a time where the elites, the elites still look after themselves, but especially now, you know what I mean? This was a time where the leaders and they didn't care about each other. There was constant war, constant combat, penal colonies were being set up all over the place. People were getting displaced, massacred, left, right, and center. This period of time is there's no clear guidance of positive morality. So to say that the pirates were any worse than the people they were fighting, no, come on. They were just doing their own thing. You know what I mean? They were just profiting off the back of people that couldn't fight back, the same that everyone else was doing. So,
I think
it's kind of a cool story.
I think the only difference is that the pirates gave the people who were being oppressed a chance to fight back, right? They were
sure.
They were oppressing some, but they also helped some others get like the chance to get after it, right? Like it's like I'm trying to think of times throughout history where the same thing has occurred, and like it's hard to pinpoint one as widespread as piracy, right? Because it's like the invention of that ship and like the maneuverability, like and how, like you said, how big the ocean is. It really did open a new door for people to like vigilante justice, kind of, right?
Yeah, it's definitely romantic, man.
100%.
Like I would have, dude. If I was like a poor,
sea shanties, bro,
guy, just slumming it, yeah, and somebody came up and was like, "Yo, you can just sing sea shanties and get drunk on the seas." Like it would be tough to say no. You're some 16-year-old full of piss and vinegar, and you just want to go like do whatever you want.
Even today, if some dude came up to me, he's like, "Hey, man, me and my boys, we got a yacht down in the Caribbean. We got a ton of rum." And we got some solid songs we all sing with each other. We're just bros. Do you want to come kick it? And I'd be like, it'd be tough for me to like. I'd be looking at my job and my girlfriend and like sweating, like, oh man, hearing the sea shanties faintly in my head.
Yeah, you even think about like Stede Bonnet getting 126 guys to come join him on this like pirate adventure that he wanted to go on. Like, how did he pull that off? How did nobody stop someone from recruiting 130 pirates and leaving town? Right? Because it was tough, man. I'm happy to wrap up there, though. I'm happy that people have joined us on this more fire. I think we fired from the hip a little bit more this episode, but that couldn't be more fitting to the topic.
I agree.
Because that's what these guys were doing.
And hopefully it was a little bit of a breath of fresh air compared to the last two, the Battle of Marathon and the Ionian Revolt, where it's just, Callimachus and then this guy and then this guy and then this guy and they did this and they traveled this far. It's fun to have the academic episodes. It's also equally fun to have the relaxed, as Riley said, fire from the hip episodes. Before Riley closes us out, if you've made it this far through the episode, I want to take a moment to apologize for our absence. Life has been tumultuous. I came down with a really bad cold and, things just kind of got in the way. But we're back. We're hoping to continue a consistent release schedule of every Monday. And yeah, if you've listened thus far, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for sticking it out. We're almost at 10 episodes of actual history episodes, excluding the history hangouts. And we hope those of you who are listening from 1 to now are here when we get to number 100. So yeah, thanks for listening to the show. And I hope you guys all have a great day or evening.
Yeah, so to help us get to 100, I'm going to touch on how to support the show. This show takes a lot of effort from us. We both got bills to pay, but we love making it. And we love that people get to come here and listen to us talk about history for an hour. I can't stress how much of an honor that is, that people spend time to listen to this show. So if you do love the show and if you want to support the show, you can go to humanhistoriespodcast.com. And from there, you can purchase books that we have set up as affiliate links, and that gives support to the show. You can also donate on Patreon to the show if you so choose. There you can also read all the show notes. You can listen to the show, and you can contact us at questions@humanhistoriespodcast.com. And you can just tell us episode ideas that you want us to cover. You can point out things we missed, tell us about things you liked. And another great thing you can do is subscribe, hit the follow button, and also for $0, just give us a nice 5-star rating. That's actually really helpful. And another thing you can do is follow us on Instagram. And if you really like the show, hit that share button and just share the show. That actually goes a long way. And so, those are all things that can help out a lot. And yeah, I just want to say thanks for listening, guys. This is awesome. I can't wait to be at 100 episodes. It's going to be epic. Take it easy, guys.